Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Lackawanna Pastimes. Thank you for joining us on what, at least out our window, is a very lovely Friday afternoon. Our program today is presented by the Historical Society's Executive Director, Mary Ann Savakinus. This is actually a program that she put together for a recent architecture conference hosted by the AIA in Scranton. We're talking today about literally the men who built Scranton. The Historical Society offers walking tours. We talk a lot about the buildings themselves, but today we're talking about the architects, the men who, again, literally built Scranton. Looking at architects from Scranton's early days in the 1840s and 50s until about 1920. So, Mary Ann, I'll turn the program over to you.
Hello, everyone. So as Sarah said, we did this a couple of weeks ago for an architectural, it was the American Institute of Architects of Scranton. So it was a whole group of architects. Not terribly intimidating, right? When they asked me to speak, they said, why don't you do Architects of Scranton? And I said, oh, cool, I can do that because there was someone many years ago who was an architect and did a whole program on Architects of Scranton. And I will share my screen and show you who he is. Maybe some of you remember him. This is Joseph Young. And Joseph Young first came to Scranton in 1953. He was a partner with the architectural firm Bellante and Claas, and he opened his own firm in 1961 and then continued to work in Scranton until he passed away in 2015. His major works included the Student Center, Library, and Resident Halls for the University of Scranton, the Cathedral High School, Keystone College's library, some dorms in the campus center, and a classroom at Penn State University. He also designed the Jewish Community Center and the Geneva House, which is on Adams Avenue. And he was the past president of Northeast Pennsylvania chapter on American Institute of Architects and the Pennsylvania Society of Architects, and a member of the Lackawanna County Arts Council. In 2006, he received the Governor Robert Casey Medal of Lifetime of Service to the community. So he was a pretty active person, and he was also an instructor at Keystone's College and a frequent lecturer for the Lackawanna Historical Society, which is where I got to meet him. I did not meet him when he gave this lecture, though, because he gave his lecture on Scranton architects in February of 1963. He presented a lecture entitled Early Architects and Architecture of Scranton to the members of the Historical Society. And in his introduction, he stated that historically, architects of Scranton were not generally the leading citizens of the city and often led rather obscure lives, designing what he called insignificant houses, offices, and stores, and leaving the more important buildings of the city and the best designed buildings to the mainly out-of-town architects. So it kind of gets interesting when we look at the history of the men who built Scranton, because many of them were not Scranton residents. So we'll talk a little bit about both as we go forward. So when Joe talked about the architects of Scranton, he was talking about how they were these kind of insignificant people that nobody knew about. And he says that the historians mostly ignored the local architects, focusing more on industrialists, bank presidents, clergy, politicians, merchants, and even morticians. In fact, he points out that only 2 architects are included in the 1906 book, Prominent Men of Scranton, and J.A. Clark only wrote about 4 of them in his 1875 History of the Wyoming Valley. Most likely the same 4 architects that are mentioned in Thomas Murphy's 1928 History of Lackawanna County. So Joe concludes that Scranton's architectural heritage is not really about individual builders, but again, rather about the general work of these few obscure unknown builders. So the first record of a named builder in the city of Scranton is William Maness. That's M-A-N-N-E-S-S. He was the contractor for the Scranton brothers and built the first rolling mill for $350,000, followed by a nail factory, then a public hall. Joe Young describes the public hall as being located on a bluff above Roaring Brook on a triangle near the junction of Lackawanna Avenue, Jefferson Avenue, and Ridge Row. Today, that is where the Radisson former Lackawanna Station building is located. And you can see a little detail from Joel Amsden's map. We'll talk a lot more about his map in a few minutes. Or maybe right now. In the 1963 lecture, Mr. Young spends a lot of time discussing the Amsden family as Scranton's first professional architectural firm. Joel Amsden was born in Vermont in 1812, attended Norwich University in New Hampshire, and then was at a semi-military academy, which was considered to be an early rival of West Point. After graduating, Joel Amsden became a civil engineer and worked for various railroads and canals in the Northeast before eventually settling in Rome, New York. There he designed several buildings between 1838 and 1846, then moved to Boston, then to Easton, Pennsylvania, and continued to work as an engineer. He finally comes to Scranton after meeting Colonel George Scranton on a business trip to New York, and he accepts his invitation for employment with the Scranton and Platt Company. That later becomes the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company. Under the supervision of Joseph Platt, Joel Amsden is tasked with laying out the new village plots, not a city yet. He is credited with setting up the wide right-of-ways of Wyoming and Lackawanna Avenue. So he kind of names our first few major streets. He names them after the valleys of the region, Wyoming and Lackawanna. And then it's also he who suggested that the cross streets be named for trees, linden, mulberry, olive, vine, and so on. It was Platt, Joseph Platt, who determined that the cross avenues that are parallel to the river be named for presidents and other great men. We know who the presidents are. The other great men are names like Franklin and Mifflin and Penn. So in 1851, Joel Amsden creates also on the corner of Lackawanna and Washington Avenue, the Amsden Block. This building stood on the block until 1914, when it was demolished and replaced with the Union Trust Company building that was designed by Edward Davis and later named the Scranton National Bank building. Today, it's the Community Bank building. Amsden operated the Valley's first stationery store on that block and was also Scranton's first postmaster. He continued his relationship with the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company and was also a resident engineer for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Joel Amsden designed many of the city's early important buildings, and he was very kind because he included them in this 1857 map. Here we see several early residents of the city, including the home of George W. Scranton and James Archibald. Two of his most significant public buildings were the First Presbyterian Church of Scranton and Scranton's first public school. If you are trying to get familiar with any of these buildings, the Archibald House once stood catty corner to where the Catlin House now stands, just to kind of give you a point of reference. Or you could look at the map and try to find it on the map. The Presbyterian church he built was after the Presbyterians organized in Scranton starting in 1845. In 1851, the firm of Scranton and Platt donated 5 lots on Washington Avenue for the church construction. It was also in 1851 that the post office was officially designated for the village of Scranton, which ended the period of our early name changes with everything from Unionville, Deep Hollow, Skunk's Misery, Slocum Hollow, Harrison, and Scrantonia before we landed on Scranton. Amsden's design for the Presbyterian church cost $150,000, and it stood on what at the time was considered to be the edge of the wilderness. The well-known 1855 George Inness painting that you see here includes the church. You can see it almost in the center of the photo. I can do this. This is the church here. And just to, again, a point of reference, if you think of where Prino's restaurant used to be or where the Hilton is now, this church stood in front of it right on the street because the street didn't go all the way to Lackawanna at the time. So it kind of shows you how the edge of the wilderness was truly there, because you don't see much else going on in this painting. So, well, we're on the subject of churches, and I know George mentioned a fire at St. Luke's a little while ago. This was also around the same time St. Luke's Episcopal Parish began plans for its first church, when their pastor, Reverend John Long, reached out to a New York architect, Richard Upjohn, to build a wooden church. Upjohn was the leading church architect in the country at the time, and best known for designing Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street in 1840. He was one of the 13 original organizers of the American Institute of Architects and its first president from 1857 to 1876. So St. Luke's was going to the top guy here. In 1852, the letter that Reverend Long wrote, and I have it in front of you, but it's worth repeating. He says, Scranton, where a few years ago there was nothing but a farmhouse, now numbers 3,500 inhabitants. And judging from the past, the place in 5 years will contain at least 10,000 inhabitants. There is now in the vicinity a respectable congregation of Episcopalians, the majority of whom are miners and iron workers. The parish has been organized, and a lot of ground, central and pleasant, has been given for a church lot by the Misters Scrantons, who are Presbyterians. The vestry is very anxious to build an economical and convenient church to cost $2,000 with accommodations for 250 to 300 persons. They want a design for a building of wood. If you ever prepare and furnish gratuitously, I feel you cannot find any point presented so needy and so worthy of your regard. So the Scrantons and the Platts donated 2 lots on the east side of Penn Avenue between Lackawanna and Spruce Street. Spruce is now Biden. And the construction began in 1852 using plans prepared by Joel Amsden. There's no evidence if Mr. Upjohn responded to Reverend Long's letter to assist with this church, but it's entirely possible since his firm, P.R.&M. Upjohn, did design the second St. Luke's Church, which is what you see here. The second St. Luke's Church was built on Wyoming Avenue between Spruce, now Biden, and Linden Streets on the edge of what was then a swamp. So we have one church being built on the edge of the wilderness. We have another church being built on the swamp lots. The Upjohns designed an Elizabethan Gothic building at the cost of $150,000, with $20,000 going into the foundation. Remember, they're on a swamp. So Scranton in the 1850s blossomed. Many improvements were made to accommodate the growing city, including utilities, streets, and services. The Scranton Gas and Water Company was chartered in 1854, and during the next 5 years constructed a pump house in Pine Brook and a reservoir on the corner of Madison and Olive in the city's hill section, which at the time was located well above every residence and business place in the city and could provide an abundant supply of water. This is the only image we have of the reservoir, so it's a little later, and you can tell because there's houses around, including that very large mansion. That was the home of Joseph A. Scranton. He was a cousin of the Scrantons, and that was located on the corner of Madison and Vine. The growing city continued to thrive, and the Scrantons expanded their enterprises to include a new railroad, which brought more and more people to the city, resulting in the need for more lodging facilities to accommodate travelers and visiting businessmen. Once again, the Iron Company donated a plot of land at the corner of Wyoming and Lackawanna, and Joel Amsden was asked to design the Wyoming House, which opened in 1852. It closed in 1890. But you can start to see things are changing throughout the city's downtown. So Joel Amsden was really the first engineer and architect coming in a formal way and building up the city of Scranton. He passed away in 1863, but from 1850 to 1906, it was the Amsdens who were considered the primary architects in Scranton, largely due to the fact that Joel's 2 sons continued their father's practice. Frank Powers Amsden was born in 1839 in Boonville, New York, was educated in Scranton and later at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York. He returned to Scranton to work in his father's general engineering and architectural firm, spending some time in New York working for the railroad. He was also a captain of the battery of artillery in the Civil War and a prominent leader of our local GAR. Frederick Joel Amsden, called Fred, was born in 1841 in Rome, New York, was also educated in Scranton before attending a preparatory academy in Stamford, Connecticut. Although he had no formal training, he excelled in architectural design at his father's firm. Like his brother, he too served in the Civil War, first as a second lieutenant for the 136th Regiment of Pennsylvania Volunteers, then as a captain for the Signal Corps. After the war, he became superintendent of the drawing department for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, then joined the family practice. He was not only active in the local GAR, but was an early leader of the Masons, a city surveyor, and an active Presbyterian. Ironically, he was responsible for most of the city's early Catholic churches. So the first Catholic Mass in Scranton was celebrated at a private home on Front Street in 1840. The Catholic Church was built in 1847 on land donated by the Iron Company, once again, at Hemlock Street and Stone Avenue. Stone Avenue is now South Webster. The church had to be rebuilt a year later after a tornado leveled the structure. So we thought that was an interesting thing last week when there was a tornado in Mahanoy City. It happened here too in the 1840s. In 1920, the new structure was replaced once again by the present Nativity Church. Nativity is now part of St. John Newman Parish. In 1858, though, the Roman Catholics began to move out of the city's south side, so land was purchased at the corner of Wyoming Avenue and Linden Street, which at the time was considered to be in the woods. Again, back to that idea that we're on the edge of the wilderness. This new centrally located Catholic church was built in Scranton as the Church of St. Vincent de Paul in 1865, and the plans were completed by the Amsdens, most likely with drawings and designs done by Fred Amsden. In 1868, 10 years later, St. Vincent de Paul would be made a cathedral and the mother church of the newly formed Diocese of Scranton. In 1883 and 84, the building was entirely remodeled under the direction of a French Catholic architect, Edwin Forrest Durang of Philadelphia, and renamed St. Peter's Cathedral. Modifications to the original Amsden design included additions of side altars, two side entrances, and the exterior towers. So they basically changed the entire look of it. And through the years, additions have continued to be made. So in these photos, you get a good look again at that wilderness section on the map. There's not a lot going on, but new things keep getting added. And then on the right, you can see the back of St. Luke's Church, and you can see St. Peter's Cathedral over towards the right. So there's a lot of building going on in Scranton at this time. So the Amsden brothers continued to operate their family firm and continue their father's practice after he died in 1863. They designed an armory for the city guard of the 13th Regiment on the 300 block of Adams Avenue in 1877, and the Hotel Holland on 406 Adams Avenue. The new armory would be built on 900 block of Adams Avenue in 1901, and this older armory would serve as a Masonic meeting place and lodge until 1928, when the Scranton Masonic Temple would be built over on Washington Avenue. In 1929, this building was torn down, the old armory, and it was replaced by the Sears Roebuck building. So you might be familiar with that on that block of Adams. And I learned this as I was doing this because I didn't know much about the Hotel Holland, but it's still standing. Who knew? The Hotel Holland is now part of the Scranton Housing Authority. So this is on that block of Adams between Mulberry Street and Vine Street. So if you're over that way, check it out because you can still see a lot of the detail in the building. So that was another Amsden design. There's nothing remaining that Joel Amsden was involved in, but it's nice to know some of Fred's work remains. Frederick died in 1906. His brother Frank died in 1895. And that's when you see things starting to change with the prominent architects working in Scranton, and the dominance of the Amsden family starts to slow down. So in his presentation, Joe Young stated that the early city directories for Scranton list Joel and Frank Amsden as civil engineers until 1867, when they finally appear as architects, along with one other person, a man named H.R. Noel. Frederick Amsden is first listed in 1870 and identified as an architect, civil and mechanical engineer, and city engineer. In 1870, Mr. Noel is listed at 415 Lackawanna Avenue. And a new name is added, a man named Cornelius Brinkerhoff, who's located at 302 Lackawanna Avenue. Sarah loves that name. I found this ad for architects, etc., in an 1868 Scranton Republican. So it further illustrates Joe Young's point that says there are some new architects turning up on the screen, specifically H.R. Noel. So H.R. Noel came to Scranton just after the Civil War and found work as a carpenter. Once he became proficient at making plans, his status was upgraded to architect. In addition, he excelled in geology, chemistry, mineralogy, botany, and he even wrote a book about the flora of Pennsylvania. For a few years, he partnered with Cornelius Brinkerhoff. Brinkerhoff was a self-trained student, also a carpenter who apprenticed in Virginia. Then at age 16, found some drawing and design work in New York and Philadelphia before finally settling in Scranton. In Joe Young's 1963 presentation, he stated that the work of these men was unknown, but he didn't have newspapers.com. So I checked newspapers.com and I found this 1874 article in the Scranton Republican listing both men as architects for the Oddfellows Hall on Main Avenue in Hyde Park. And in August 1878, Cornelius Brinkerhoff even submitted plans and drawings for a new county courthouse. In his plan, the cost of the courthouse, and I want you to remember this, would be $42,000. More about that in a minute. So Scranton continues to prosper and grow in the 1870s through the 1890s, and the number of architects listed in the city directories began to show a steady increase, with more than 20 different architectural offices appearing in the early 1900 editions. Mr. Young estimated in his lecture that between 1850 and 1920, there were about 85 different individuals practicing architecture in Scranton. But of these, he says only a few were trained and capable, and many names appeared for only 1 year. He points out that at the time, professional practices, ethics, licensing, and educational training were not required as they are today. So many of the individuals listed were actually mining engineers, civil engineers, carpenters, masons, and what we might consider general contractors today. He cites the example of a man named E.A. Bartle, who is listed as an architect in the directories from 1892 to 1895, with an office on the 3rd floor of the Lackawanna Trust and Safe Deposit Building on 400 Lackawanna Avenue. But the sign on the building clearly lists him as a civil and mining engineer. Young determined that of the 85 men who called themselves architects in Scranton from 1850 to 1920, only a few did a significant volume of work, and repeats that many of the city's most important buildings, the public and institutional buildings, were the work of out-of-town architects. So let's consider the county courthouse. I mentioned a minute ago that Cornelius Brinkerhoff submitted plans for a new county courthouse on August 1st, 1878. But the county was not officially incorporated until August 21st, 1878. So he was a little ahead of things. In fact, construction for the courthouse would not be started until 1881. This is a good example of how important buildings were designed by out-of-town architects, because the plans for this building to be constructed on land donated by, guess who, the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, along with the Susquehanna and Wyoming Valley Railroad and Coal Company, were accepted by county commissioners from Isaac Perry of Binghamton, New York, in January of 1881. Perry's bid came in at $139,924. So if they went with Brinkerhoff, they would have saved about $100,000. However, there were extras in excavation for the foundation of $31,000 because if you remember, this is part of that swamp lot section of the city where St. Luke's had built their church about 15 years earlier. It's even more interesting that in the 1890s, there had to be some interior renovations made to this building. So they hired another Binghamton architect by the name of T.I. Lacey. But to be fair, he did advertise in the Scranton City Directory with a Scranton address. So we could kind of let him slide there. Of the 85 architects who did live in Scranton between 1850 and 1920, Joe Young narrowed the list down to 6, not counting the Amsdens, that he considered to be significant. These included Edwin L. Walter, Fred L. Brown, John A. Duckworth, Lansing Holden, Edward Davis, and Edward Langley. And remember, this is just up to 1920. When Joe Long did this in 1963, many of the architects who were around in 1920 were still around in 1963. So he didn't want to, call out anybody and, have a lawsuit. In a 1905 article in the Scranton Republican, 5 of the gentlemen that Joe Young selected were also featured along with some other folks. For some reason, E.L. Walter was not featured, but I did include his 1929 obituary here just to see that he was a pioneer architect for the city of Scranton. But these were considered the most gifted architects in the region, not just by Joe Young in his paper, but by the newspaper in 1905. So, and Walter would eventually join these men. Edwin Walter began his career in Prompton, Pennsylvania, where he worked as a carpenter for his father and studied drawing and architecture in his spare time. He came to Scranton at first to work for the Dixon Manufacturing Company, and in 1870, he joined the Amsden firm. In 1885, he was the architect for Lackawanna County's jail, which was completed in 1887. And in 1886, he became a member of the American Institute of Architects. And in 1888, he designed City Hall, which was completed in 1893. Frederick Lord Brown practiced in Scranton from 1884 to 1920. He was born in Sag Harbor, Long Island, graduated in architecture from Cornell, and worked for the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and was a supervising architect for the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. He came to Scranton in 1883 and formed a partnership with Percival Morris, but the partnership was dissolved within 2 years, and Brown continued to practice independently. In 1891, he built the Dime Bank building, which Benjamin Troup described as one of the ornaments of the city. And in 1899, he was the architect for St. Luke's Parish House. He also completed the Central City Fire Headquarters on Mulberry Street as an annex for City Hall in 1905. And that would be Frederick Lord Brown. John A. Duckworth was the son of a sculptor and a decorative plasterer who settled in New Jersey after fighting in the American Revolution and eventually moved to Toronto. John A. studied architects at the Mechanics Institute in Toronto, then worked with a Toronto-based firm that designed the city's Parliament building. He left Toronto to work in New York in 1880, then moved around the country working in San Francisco, Chicago, and Buffalo before arriving in Wilkes-Barre in 1882. A year later, he moved to Scranton. He worked for different firms in the city before opening his own practice in 1884 and spent the next 25 years designing more than 600 buildings in northeastern Pennsylvania until his death in 1912. He's buried in the Dunmore Cemetery, and it's one of my absolute favorite tombstones. It's this beautiful carved angel. So I kind of attribute it to the fact that he was the son of a sculptor and such a prominent architect in the city. Sarah said also an overachiever. One of his first projects, talk about overachieving, was the Coal Exchange Building in 1885, which was also where his office was located. This building was demolished in 1963. Other buildings he designed include the Hotel German in 1894, St. Rose Church in Carbondale, and various public schools, including the number 25 Jefferson School on School Street, which was remodeled in 1962. His son, John Spencer Duckworth, was born in 1884, graduated from Cornell in 1912, and spent a year abroad before returning to Scranton to continue his father's business. He moved to New Mexico in 1939. But in 1914, he was practicing here, and he was the architect for the Comfort Stations under Courthouse Square, and also for St. Thomas Parish Hall in Archibald, which now houses the Borough Building and the Archibald Historical Society. This was also my grade school, so I had to include it. Ooh, my picture is blurry. Please take my apologies for this. Scranton started to see a lot of changes after 1900. The Iron Works moved to New York State, just outside of Buffalo, to a town that would be named Lackawanna, New York. The early New England settlers who founded the city were no longer running things. New forces and influences were taking charge. Former miners became coal mine owners, and immigrants were putting down roots to become important social and political leaders. The city's population continued to grow, and new buildings were popping up everywhere. Some of the buildings constructed at this time by the out-of-town designers included the YMCA on Mulberry Street and Adams Avenue, which was designed by Seymour Davis of Philadelphia, the Church of the Nativity by George Kramer of New York, and the Delaware Lackawanna Western Passenger Station was designed by Kenneth Murchison, also of New York. Another out-of-town architect during this period was a man named Lansing C. Holden. He was from New York. He was born in 1855 and served as an architect for the DL&W Railroad, designing the company's New York City office. He also designed the city hospital in Bayonne, New Jersey. But he's first mentioned in Scranton for his association with Isaac Perry, who was the man who designed the county courthouse. He was also a designer of Moses Taylor Hospital in 1891. In 1895, he prepared the drawings for the alterations of the Connell Building and a two-story addition for the extension of the Commonwealth Building, which is now the Brooks Building. The Commonwealth Building is where he listed his Scranton office in 1896's Scranton City Directory. Possibly his most significant building was the First Presbyterian Church, a parsonage at the corner of Madison and Olive on the site of the old reservoir. If you remember, I showed you the picture of the reservoir earlier. Today, we know it as Covenant Presbyterian Church. The parsonage was completed in 1898, and after church construction was postponed until 1902. So it wasn't dedicated till 1904. Lansing Holden was also responsible for designing the new armory for the 13th Regiment. Today we know it as the Watchers Armory on the 900 block of Adams Avenue. And he designed many residences throughout the city, including the home of Thomas Watkins at 520 Monroe Avenue, which was later the home of Judge Maxey. And then he also designed the Hebrew Day School, which stood until it was condemned and demolished in 1977. Holden was active in professional societies in New York and largely responsible for the AIA Code of Ethics. He was made a fellow for the Institute in 1912 and closed his Scranton in 1905, moving to New York, where he died in 1930. Edward Langley. Yay, we like Edward Langley. Edward Langley practiced architecture in Scranton for more than 30 years. He was born in Toronto in 1873, was the son of an architect. He spent his younger years in California and returned to Toronto at age 18 to work for his cousin's architectural firm. Later, he moved to New York and entered into the firm of Little and O'Connor. Little and O'Connor completed the Oral School in Scranton in 1894 and were next the architects for the Scranton High School, which opened in 1896. It was the work on the high school that brought Langley to Scranton. It seems that it was a woman named Carolyn Albright Bunnell who was the reason he stayed in Scranton. They were married in 1905, and he's first listed in Scranton City Directories in 1902. Edward Davis is the last architect that Joe Young lists in his Scranton Architects presentation, primarily because his work bridges from the late 19th century into the first quarter of the 20th century. Edward Herbert Davis was born in Washington, D.C. in 1867 and graduated from the Washington School of Fine Arts. After graduation, he worked in Washington for 3 years and then moved to Wilkes-Barre and then to Scranton in 1892, where he worked until 1919. He was skilled as a designer and delineator and was recognized with a medal from the St. Louis Exposition in 1904 for his design of the Home of the Friendless. He was active in AIA, president for the Building Code Commission of Scranton, and an early member of the State Commission for Registration of Architecture. In 1914, his 12-story Union Bank replaced the old Amsden block on Lackawanna Avenue. So we started with the Amsdens, and Joel Amsden had his big block set up here where he had a lot of early merchants. And we end here with the Union National Bank set up by Lewis. Now, Lewis in 1919 sets up a partnership with, Davis sets up a partnership with George M.D. Lewis in 1919. George M.D. Lewis was a 1917 graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's architecture program and had recently returned from the war after flying for Captain LaGuardia, later a mayor of New York. Lewis was retained by Paul Beelan to travel and study his idea of a community house, which would ultimately be the construction of the Waverly Community House. As partners, Davis and Lewis designed the Scranton Gas and Water Company building on Jefferson Avenue and many other buildings. But as I said when I started, this would be a part 2 where we get into the 1920s and look at the work of Lewis and Davis and the architects that came at the same time. 1920 marks the peak of Scranton's growth with a population of just over 140,000 people, including what Joe Young called young draftsmen who trained and worked in established architectural offices throughout the city, the men who would become the architects of the future. Which brings me back to Edward Langley, because Edward Langley designed the Scranton Club. And when I gave this lecture to a group of young architects, I was in the Scranton Club. So I wanted to let them know that the people we're talking about were very present in the point. Langley died in 1936, and he left $104,000 to the American Institute of Architects to establish an architectural scholarship to aid the US and Canadian students. He obviously saw what Joe Young points out and wanted to support future architects like the people I was speaking to a few weeks ago. So there's much more I can talk about, but we really just wanted to kind of give the early architects a little spotlight. And then sometime in the future, I'll come back and I'll talk about other architects that you might want to hear about. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, I have a question. In downtown Scranton, when the mall was built, demolishing all those old buildings, I know you have a video and done presentations on the block there. But wasn't there any, because I wasn't living, well, was I? Yes, I guess I was I left the area for many years. I have to remember when I came back, but the mall was built when I came back. Was there any big concern about the destruction of all these old good architectural buildings at the time? And
there was a lot of concern. The Architectural Heritage Association was the main component or opponent to, tearing down Lackawanna Avenue, basically ruining all of that history. And there was mitigation done so that AHA received some financial compensation, and then they use that money. I think they still do. Every year they give awards out to residences throughout the city that are kept in a significant architectural status. They don't I don't think they do public buildings, but they do private homes, and they give awards out for that. I'm trying to think what else happened with it. Jane Jacobs, I think she was here. Richard Leonori, I think he met her at that point, because all of the architects in town were pretty much trying to fight the demolition of Lackawanna Avenue. I had just started working here. I don't even know if I was truly on the staff here when that happened, or it just came right after. But they did fight it. There was a lot of opposition to it happening. But at the same time, if you consider the state of Scranton and the need for something to change economically, the idea of a mall on some status was thought to be the way to save the city. I'm not sure if it did, but we did lose a lot of phenomenal buildings. And then the Hotel Casey went down maybe 10 years later. So buildings continue to leave. But I still think that Scranton is very fortunate in a way, for that same kind of depressed status that we were getting out of in the 90s. We had been in it from really the 60s through the 90s. And that depression, that economic stall, kept us from doing any really big demolition in buildings. And so a lot of our buildings are here because of that. And now there's this idea that they can be reutilized and saved. Look at Scranton Lace Works. Look at the Pen Paper building that's behind George. I mean, that's sitting over there right now, but I know the owner's got some plans, and he's kind enough to give us space to put things in there. So there are people now that are looking at the old buildings and how they can be kept and used. But unfortunately, in the early 1990s, that was not the plan.
Okay,
Does that help?
thank you.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Anything else?
Well, I ought to thank you. Besides being a wonderful program, you've just identified another picture for sure.
I hope I can find it.
And some of you don't realize that I'm a resident of Scranton, and doing a major program. And 3 weeks ago, I was in Scranton with a whole bunch of photographs I printed, and it's, was where the hell is it? And as you mentioned, there was a ton of buildings not there. And I was in that block of Adams Avenue where the little hotel was. And I thought that in this care home, it looked like an old building in there, and I wasn't sure, but damn it, you've just ID'd another photograph. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That
We
makes
ought to
me
do
feel
more.
better.
We ought to do more of these.
Well,
Because
we'll
let's,
come back. I don't know when. I'll come back and I'll do 1920s through the 60s or something. Well,
yeah, I remember seeing the coal exchange building. I used to wait for a bus at the Globe store, and I'd stare at it and wonder what the heck it was. And I was about 12,
yeah.
13 maybe. And, I can still remember it saying coal exchange on the top of the building.
Turning it back over to Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay, again, thank you, Mary Ann, for joining us, for that information about architects, but also for answering questions that we didn't know we had. So there's some new information about primary individuals in Scranton's history. Our next program, our next Pastimes episode, will be Friday, June 28th. We'll be joined by a friend of mine, professor at Shippensburg University, Alan Dietrich Ward, who will be talking about a new book that he has coming up in October called Cradle of Conservation. He'll be focusing on environmental history and the history of conservation in Pennsylvania. That ties a lot into our friend Gifford Pinchot, who was the governor of Pennsylvania in the 1920s and lives nearby in Milford. Pinchot had a long history of conservation and environmentalism himself. That'll be our next program again on June 28th. Again, thank you everybody for joining us.